The German mechanic lit a cigarette and leaned against the wing of his fighter plane. It was past midnight. The desert was black and silent, and this airfield sat 200 miles behind the front line. He felt safe. Why wouldn't he? No enemy tank could reach him out here. No bomber could find him in this emptiness. The British were far away, dug into their trenches, bleeding into the sand. He'd heard the jokes back at the mess. Some British general had supposedly built a unit to sneak through the desert on foot. A phantom brigade. His officers had laughed. Men don't cross an ocean of sand and walk onto an airfield. It couldn't be done. He took a long drag, and that's when he heard it. A soft click. Metal on metal. Right underneath the fuel tank behind him. He turned. He saw a shadow crawling away between the wheels. Human, fast gone then, the first plane exploded. A wall of orange lifted a fighter clean off its wheels and threw it burning across the sand. Then the next one went. And the next. The whole line of aircraft erupting one after another, like a string of firecrackers made of fire and fuel. Men ran screaming. Bullets flew at nothing. The raiders were already vanishing into the dark. This is the story of the unit the British Army almost threw in the bin. The men they called a suicide club. To understand why they were mocked, you have to understand 1941. North Africa. The war was going badly. Very badly. The desert stretched for 1,000 miles, flat and merciless. And across it 2 armies clawed back and forth like drowning men. 1 month the British pushed west. The next month the Germans shoved them all the way back east. Nobody could hold ground for long. And in the middle of it stood one man the British had learned to fear. Rommel, the Desert Fox. He moved his panzers faster than anyone thought possible, appeared where he shouldn't have been, and smashed British columns before they even knew he was there. But Rommel had a weakness. And it flew. His entire advance ran on aircraft. German and Italian planes owned the skies over the desert. They spotted British movements from above. They bombed the supply convoys crawling up the coast road. They shot Allied fighters out of the sky before the pilots could even climb. Every ship the British sent to Malta or Tobruk had to sail under those wings. And ship after ship went down. Men drowned in the dark holds. Tanks and food and fuel sank to the bottom of the Mediterranean. The British tried to fight back the normal way, send bombers to hit the airfields. But the airfields sat deep in the desert, hidden, ringed with anti-aircraft guns. Most bombers never found them. The ones that did got torn apart. The maths was brutal and simple. As long as those planes flew, British boys kept dying by the thousand. And nobody had a way to stop them. The generals were out of ideas. What they needed was a madman with a better one. His name was David Stirling. And on paper, he was a disaster. 6'6", slouching, lazy, by his own admission. His fellow officers had a nickname for him, the Giant Sloth. He gambled. He drank. He slept through morning parades. One instructor called him one of the worst recruits he'd ever tried to train. But behind those heavy, half-closed eyes, something sharp was turning. Stirling had volunteered for the Commandos, an elite raiding force. But by 1941, the Commandos in the desert had become a bitter failure. Their big seaborne raids kept getting canceled or falling apart. The whole force was being quietly disbanded. Broken up, sent back to their regiments in disgrace. Stirling refused to accept it. Then, during a parachute jump and experiment, really, with equipment nobody trusted, his chute snagged and tore on the tail of the plane. He plummeted. Slammed into the desert floor. For a while, he couldn't feel his legs. He lay in a Cairo hospital bed, paralyzed from the waist down, staring at the ceiling. And that ceiling became the birthplace of an idea. He thought, everyone is doing this wrong. Why send hundreds of men in a big, loud raid the enemy can see coming? Why not send 4 or 5 tiny teams, slipping into the desert like ghosts, hitting the airfields not from the air, but from the ground, on foot, in the dark, planting bombs on the planes while the guards slept? Small, silent, cheap, deadly slowly. The feeling came back to his legs. And the moment it did, Stirling knew he had to reach the one man who could say yes, the high command itself. But he also knew the staff officers, the desk men he sneered at as fossilized, would bury his idea in paperwork forever. So he didn't ask permission. Still limping, still healing, he hobbled up to the headquarters gate on crutches. The sentry turned him away. So Stirling waited, ditched the crutches, squeezed through a gap in the wire fence, and simply walked into the most guarded building in the Middle East. He burst into a startled general's office. And in about 3 minutes, before anyone could throw him out, he pitched his crazy plan. Incredibly, they said yes. Well, sort of. The high command didn't believe in it. Not really. But they were desperate, and Stirling's idea was cheap. If a handful of misfits got themselves killed in the desert, so what? It cost the army almost nothing to let them try. So they let him raise 66 men. And they gave the new unit a deliberately silly, misleading name. Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. Here's the joke buried inside that name. There was no brigade. There was no A through K detachment either. The whole thing was a lie invented to fool German spies into believing Britain had a huge secret airborne army in the desert. In reality, the Special Air Service was 60-odd men, a few tents, and a leader who could barely walk. The rest of the army thought it was ridiculous. Airborne? They had no planes of their own. Elite? Half of them were rejects and troublemakers nobody else wanted. And the plan creeping across the deadliest desert on Earth to blow up aircraft by hand sounded less like strategy and more like suicide. That was the word that stuck. Suicide Club. But Stirling had found the right men. Chief among them was a quiet, obsessive officer named Lewes, who set out to solve the unit's biggest problem. What do you actually blow a plane up with? A standard bomb was too heavy. You could carry only 2 or 3. And plain explosive might punch a hole in a wing without setting the fuel alight. Lewes needed something small enough to carry by the dozen that would both explode and burn. He experimented for weeks, mixing, testing, failing, and finally he built it. A lump of plastic explosive kneaded together with thermite and a smear of oil. No bigger than a fist. It blew apart and then burst into a fireball hot enough to ignite aviation fuel. They called it the Lewes bomb. Now, one man could carry enough destruction in his pack to wipe out an entire squadron. The tools were ready. The men were ready. The first mission was set for November 1941. They would parachute into the desert at night, ahead of a big British offensive, and destroy the enemy fighters before they could ever take off. It went catastrophically wrong. The night they jumped, the desert turned on them. A savage storm blew in winds far too strong for parachutes. Any sane commander would have canceled. But Stirling feared that if this first mission was scrubbed, the doubters would shut the unit down forever. So they went. It was a slaughter. The wind scattered them for miles. Men slammed into the rocky ground at terrible speed, then got dragged across the desert by their billowing chutes. Bones snapped. Some were knocked senseless and never recovered. Others simply vanished into the storm and were never seen again. Of the roughly 60 men who jumped that night, only 22 came back. The Suicide Club had lived up to its name on the very first try. This was the moment it should have ended. And it nearly did. But Stirling made a decision that changed everything. If they couldn't safely jump in, they would drive in. He teamed up with another desert unit, the long-range desert group navigation experts, who crossed the open sand like sailors crossing an ocean, steering by sun and stars. They became the taxi service. They would carry the SAS hundreds of miles through the deep desert, drop them near a target in the dark, and wait to bring the survivors home. And now the killing began in earnest. Picture it from the German side. You're a guard on a desert airfield. Your planes stand in neat, quiet rows. The nearest enemy is 100 miles away. Then, in the pitch black, shapes move between your aircraft. You can't see them. You can't hear them over the wind. By the time the first bomb goes off, they are already gone. Paddy Mayne, a huge, terrifying Irishman, with fists like sledgehammers, became the unit's deadliest raider. On one airfield, he strolled down the line of parked planes, calmly slapping a bomb onto each one. When he ran out of bombs on the last aircraft, they say he tore the cockpit apart with his bare hands. Night after night, the airfields burned. And a new kind of fear crept into the German camps. Not the fear of a battle. Worse, it was the fear that you were never safe. Not asleep. Not in the rear. Not anywhere. That the desert itself might come alive and kill you in the dark. The ghosts had a name now, and the enemy had started to whisper it. By the summer of 1942, Stirling grew bolder. For months they had struck on foot, silent, patient, invisible. But now he had a fleet of jeeps, each one bristling with pairs of machine guns stripped from wrecked aircraft. Weapons that could spit out 1,000 rounds a minute. So he threw the rulebook away and tried something insane. On the night of the 26th of July, 18 SAS jeeps rolled up to a packed enemy airfield at Sidi Hanish. No sneaking this time. Stirling formed them into 2 long lines, drove straight onto the field with engines roaring, and opened fire. It was a river of tracer, streams of glowing bullets pouring into aircraft after aircraft, engines shredding, fuel tanks bursting, the whole field lighting up like daylight. The jeeps thundered down the runway, guns hammering, then simply melted back into the desert. In a handful of minutes, they destroyed dozens of planes. The raids had become so effective that the German command was rattled to its core. Rommel himself is said to have taken a personal interest in the Phantom Raiders tearing up his airfields, later admitting that Stirling's handful of men caused his army more damage than almost any other force of its size. High praise, and a warning. Because fear curdles into something ugly. The Germans couldn't catch these men in the act. So, in October 1942, Hitler issued a chilling order, the Commando Order. Any captured commando or raider, even in uniform, even with his hands raised in surrender, was to be executed. No trial, no mercy, a bullet in the sand. This was the true price on their heads. And it fell on them. Captured SAS men, soldiers who had surrendered honorably, were handed over and shot or worked to death, purely for being who they were. The enemy's respect had turned into murder. Stirling himself was finally run down and captured in early 1943. He escaped 4 times. 4 times they caught him again. In the end, they locked him inside the fortress of Colditz and threw away the key. They had taken the founder off the board. But they were far too late. The idea was already loose in the world. And you cannot capture an idea, because that ragtag suicide club, 60 misfits, and a leader who couldn't walk, destroyed more enemy aircraft on the ground than the entire RAF shot out of the sky over that same stretch of desert. Think about that. A handful of mocked, written-off men did more damage to Rommel's air power than whole squadrons of fighter planes. The unit they laughed at became the most feared special force on Earth. The SAS didn't die in the sand. It grew. And every elite special operations unit that came after it in every army in the world borrowed the same blueprint. Small teams. Deep behind the lines. Who dares wins. David Stirling was knighted before he died. The Giant Sloth. The lazy officer his instructors nearly threw out. History remembers him now by a different name, the Phantom Major. And somewhere in the story of that war, there is a version of that German mechanic. The one leaning on his fighter plane, 200 miles behind the line, safe as houses, laughing at the idea that anyone could ever reach him out there in the empty dark. He took his long, easy drag on that cigarette. He heard a soft click of metal beneath the fuel tank, and in one wall of fire, he finally understood exactly what the British had built. They had called them a suicide club. Rommel called them ghosts.